The coffee mug was still warm when Margaret Sullivan walked out of her suburban Cleveland home every Tuesday morning at exactly 8:47 a.m., and for 15 years, nobody questioned where the perfect mother of three disappeared to until Friday evening. But what her husband David discovered in her nightstand drawer 3 days after her funeral would reveal a secret so shocking that it would rewrite everything this quiet Ohio neighborhood thought they knew about the woman they'd trusted with their children, their secrets, and their lives. Margaret had perfected the art of vanishing in plain sight. Every Monday night, she would kiss her children goodnight with the same gentle smile that had comforted scraped knees and broken hearts, tuck them into beds with military precision, and set out clothes for David that coordinated perfectly with his work schedule. By Tuesday morning, she transformed into someone else entirely, though no one in Maple Ridge subdivision had ever suspected that the woman loading a small overnight bag into her Honda Civic was living a double life that would have destroyed everything they believed about motherhood, marriage, and the people we think we know best. The neighbors had grown accustomed to Margaret's Tuesday through Friday absence. She'd explained them away as caring for her sick mother in Toledo, a story that seemed perfectly reasonable for a woman whose devotion to family had become legendary throughout their community. Martha Henderson, from next door, would often comment to other neighbors about how admirable Margaret was, sacrificing 4 days every week to care for an aging parent, while maintaining a household that looked like it belonged in Better Homes and Gardens magazine. The lawn was always perfectly manicured, the children's schedules ran like clockwork, and David never seemed to lack for anything despite his wife's regular disappearances. But here's what made Margaret's story so convincing and so devastating when the truth finally emerged. She actually didn't have a living mother. Margaret's mother had died in a car accident when Margaret was 19, a fact that somehow had never come up in casual conversation during the 15 years the Sullivans had lived in Maple Ridge. The elaborate fiction she'd constructed required maintaining fake phone calls, sending herself flowers on Mother's Day that she claimed were from her grateful parent, and even creating a fictional address in Toledo that she could reference when neighbors asked about her mother's condition. The children, Emma, now 16, Michael, 14, and little Sophie, just 8 years old, had never questioned their mother's absences because Margaret had made them part of the routine. Every Friday evening, she would return with small gifts and stories about Grandma Rose, a woman they'd never met but felt they knew intimately through Margaret's detailed narrative. Emma would later tell investigators that she'd always found it strange that they never visited Grandma Rose or that the elderly woman never came to visit them, but Margaret's explanations about her mother's fragile health and the difficulty of travel had seemed reasonable at the time. David Sullivan worked as an insurance adjuster, a job that required him to travel frequently throughout northern Ohio investigating claims and assessing property damage. His schedule perfectly complemented Margaret's disappearances, with most of his overnight trips falling during her Tuesday through Friday absences. When David was home, Margaret was the attentive wife and mother that their neighbors envied. When Margaret was gone, David assumed the domestic responsibilities, with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to manage a household in his wife's absence. Neither questioned the other's schedule, trusting in a marriage that had weathered 16 years and produced 3 children who seemed well-adjusted and happy. The routine continued without disruption from September 2000 until Margaret's sudden death from a brain aneurysm on March 5. She'd been found unconscious in the parking lot of a Walmart in downtown Cleveland, apparently having collapsed while loading groceries into her Honda Civic on what should have been an ordinary Monday afternoon. The emergency room doctors at Metro Health Medical Center worked for 3 hours to save her life, but the damage to her brain was too extensive. Margaret died without regaining consciousness, taking with her the secrets that had defined more than a third of her adult life. David's discovery of Margaret's true activities began 3 days after the funeral, when he finally worked up the emotional strength to begin sorting through her personal belongings. Emma had been asking about a jewelry box that she remembered her mother keeping in the bedroom, and David had promised to look for it among Margaret's things. The jewelry box wasn't in any of the obvious places, so David began searching through the nightstand drawers that he'd never had reason to examine during their marriage. The first drawer contained the usual assortment of items that accumulate in bedroom furniture: reading glasses, lip balm, a few expired coupons, and a small notebook that Margaret had used to jot down grocery lists and appointment reminders. But the second drawer revealed something that made David's hands shake as he lifted out a manila envelope thick with documents and photographs that he'd never seen before. His wife's handwriting on the envelope read "Cincinnati, do not open," in the careful script that had addressed thousands of birthday cards and school permission slips over the years. Inside the envelope, David found evidence of a life that Margaret had lived entirely separate from the suburban existence they'd shared. Rental agreements for a small apartment on Vine Street in Cincinnati's over-the-Rhine neighborhood, signed in Margaret's maiden name of Margaret Collins. Bank statements for an account that David had never known existed, showing regular deposits and withdrawals that spanned 15 years. Most shocking of all were dozens of photographs showing Margaret with people David had never met, in places he'd never been, living what appeared to be a completely different life every Tuesday through Friday for a decade and a half. The photographs revealed a Margaret that David had never seen. Gone was the conservative clothing and careful hairstyle that she maintained in Cleveland. The woman in these pictures wore flowing skirts and bohemian jewelry, her hair long and loose in a style that made her look 10 years younger. She was shown laughing with groups of people at what appeared to be art galleries, coffee shops, and outdoor festivals. In some pictures, she was playing guitar on a small stage, something David had never known she could do. In others, she was teaching what looked like art classes to groups of children and adults in a studio setting filled with easels and canvases. But the most devastating discovery was a series of photographs showing Margaret with a man David had never seen before. The pictures spanned several years, showing the progression of what was clearly an intimate relationship. There were casual shots of them walking hand in hand through Cincinnati's streets, formal pictures of them dressed up for what appeared to be gallery openings or theater events, and candid photographs that captured the kind of comfortable intimacy that develops over years of shared experience. The man appeared to be in his early 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that looked at Margaret with obvious affection and admiration. David sat on his bedroom floor, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's secret life, trying to process the reality that the woman he'd been married to for 16 years had been living as someone else entirely, for nearly as long as he'd known her. The Margaret Collins revealed in these documents and photographs bore almost no resemblance to the Margaret Sullivan who had packed his lunches and attended parent-teacher conferences and organized elaborate birthday parties for their children. This other Margaret was an artist, a performer, someone who seemed to move through the world with a freedom and spontaneity that was completely at odds with the structured, responsible woman who had been the cornerstone of their family's stability. The rental agreement revealed that Margaret had been paying for the Cincinnati apartment since September 2006, just 3 months after Sophie was born. The timing seemed significant, though David couldn't yet understand what had prompted his wife to create this elaborate alternate existence when their youngest child was still an infant. The bank statements showed that Margaret had been funding her double life through a combination of part-time work that she'd never mentioned and careful management of their household budget. She'd been skimming small amounts from their joint checking account over the years, never enough to raise David's suspicions but sufficient to maintain her apartment and support her activities in Cincinnati. The children's reactions to their father's discoveries varied according to their ages and personality. Emma, who at 16 was old enough to understand the implications of her mother's deception, felt betrayed by the revelation that the woman who had taught her about honesty and integrity had been living a lie for most of Emma's life. Michael, 14 and already struggling with typical teenage questions about identity and authenticity, seemed almost impressed by his mother's ability to maintain such an elaborate secret. 8-year-old Sophie didn't fully understand what her father had found, but she sensed the tension and sadness that filled their house in the days following Margaret's funeral. David's investigation into his wife's secret life began with a drive to Cincinnati that he made alone on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after Margaret's death. The apartment building on Vine Street was a converted warehouse that had been transformed into artists' lofts, the kind of hip urban housing that was completely different from the suburban neighborhood where they'd raised their family. The building's manager, a woman named Carol, who appeared to be in her 60s, recognized Margaret's name immediately and expressed genuine sorrow about her death. Carol revealed that Margaret had been known in the building as Maggie Collins, an artist and music teacher who had rented apartment 4B for. She was well liked by her neighbors, who knew her as a quiet but friendly woman who often could be heard practicing guitar in the evenings and who taught art classes to local children on weekends. Carol mentioned that Maggie had seemed troubled in recent months, as if she was struggling with some kind of decision or conflict that she couldn't resolve. She'd been asking questions about breaking her lease early, though she'd never followed through with actually moving out of the apartment. The apartment itself was a revelation that completed David's understanding of the woman his wife had been when she wasn't being his wife. The space was filled with artwork that Margaret had created over the years, paintings, sculptures and mixed media pieces that demonstrated a talent and passion that she'd never shared with her family. The walls were covered with photographs of Margaret performing at local venues, teaching art classes and participating in community events throughout Cincinnati. It was clear that Maggie Collins had been an integral part of the over-the-Rhine arts community, someone who was known and respected for her contributions to local culture and education. But the most shocking discovery in the apartment was a series of journals that Margaret had kept throughout her 15 years of living this double life. The journals revealed the emotional cost of maintaining two separate identities and the gradual toll that her deception had taken on her mental health and sense of self. In early entries from 2006, Margaret wrote about feeling trapped by the expectations of motherhood and marriage, describing herself as someone who had lost her individual identity in the process of becoming a wife and mother. She wrote about discovering the apartment by accident during a day trip to Cincinnati and feeling an immediate sense of possibility and freedom that she hadn't experienced since before her children were born. The journals documented Margaret's careful construction of her alternate identity, describing how she'd researched her fictional mother's illness and created detailed backstories that would support her absences from home. She wrote about the guilt she felt about deceiving David and the children, but also about the sense of authenticity and joy she experienced during her days as Maggie Collins. The entries revealed a woman who was deeply conflicted about her choices but who felt unable to reconcile her need for individual expression with her responsibilities as a mother and wife. As the years progressed, the journal entries became increasingly focused on a relationship that Margaret had developed with someone she referred to only as Jim. The progression of this relationship from friendship to something more intimate was documented in entries that revealed Margaret's struggle with the ethical implications of her emotional infidelity. She wrote about falling in love with someone who knew her as Maggie Collins, someone who appreciated her art and her music and her independent spirit in ways that she felt David never had or could. But she also wrote about the impossibility of her situation, knowing that she could never fully commit to either life without destroying the other. The identity of Jay was revealed when David found a stack of letters hidden in a shoebox in Margaret's apartment closet. The letters, written over a period of several years, were from a man named Jonathan Mitchell, who worked as a curator at the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati. Jonathan's letters revealed a deep and genuine love for the woman he knew as Maggie, but they also showed his growing frustration with her inability to make a commitment to their relationship. In his most recent letter, dated just 2 months before Margaret's death, Jonathan had given her an ultimatum. She needed to decide whether she was going to continue living a double life or finally choose to be with him permanently. Jonathan Mitchell was devastated when David contacted him to inform him of Margaret's death. During their painful conversation, Jonathan revealed that he had known Maggie for 7 years, having met her at an art exhibition where she was displaying some of her painting. He'd been immediately attracted to her creativity and her passion for art, qualities that she'd told him had been suppressed during her marriage to a man who didn't understand or appreciate her artistic nature. Jonathan had believed that Maggie was divorced and that her children lived with their father, an elaboration of her deception that had allowed her to maintain their relationship without revealing the full extent of her double life. The revelation that the woman he'd loved and wanted to marry was actually still married with 3 children living at home was almost as shocking to Jonathan as the discovery of Margaret's secret life had been to David. Both men had been in love with versions of the same woman, neither fully understanding the complete picture of who she really was or the complex web of deception she'd maintained for 15 years. Jonathan's grief was complicated by his realization that the woman he'd known as Maggie Collins had never truly existed as a complete person, but was instead a carefully constructed persona that allowed Margaret to express parts of herself that she felt unable to share with her family. The impact of Margaret's revelations extended far beyond her immediate family. The neighbors in Maple Ridge who had admired her as the perfect mother and wife struggled to reconcile their memories of Margaret with the reality of her secret life. Martha Henderson, who had often relied on Margaret for childcare and had considered her a close friend, felt betrayed by the discovery that Margaret's absences had been lies rather than acts of family devotion. Other neighbors began questioning their own assumptions about the families around them, wondering what secrets might be hidden behind other perfectly maintained facades. The children's adjustment to their mother's posthumous revelations created new challenges for David as a single parent. Emma, who had been planning to study business in college, began showing interest in art programs and creative writing, as if she was trying to connect with the artistic side of her mother that she'd never known existed. Michael became withdrawn and began asking difficult questions about honesty, authenticity, and whether it was possible to truly know another person. Sophie, too young to fully understand the situation, seemed to sense that her memories of her mother were somehow incomplete or false, leading to nightmares and behavioral changes that required professional counseling. David's own process of grieving was complicated by his conflicting emotions about Margaret's deception. He felt betrayed by her lies but also impressed by the elaborate effort she'd put into maintaining her double life. He was hurt that she'd never shared her artistic talents with their family, but also understood that she might have felt unable to express that side of herself within the context of their marriage. Most painfully, he wondered whether their entire relationship had been based on a false understanding of who Margaret really was and whether she'd ever truly loved him or had simply been fulfilling expectations that she felt unable to escape. The discovery of Margaret's journals revealed that her internal conflict about her double life had been escalating in the months before her death. She'd written about feeling increasingly unable to maintain the emotional energy required to be two different people and about her fear that her deception would eventually be discovered by David or the children. Her final journal entry, written just a week before her death, suggested that she'd been planning to end one of her lives but hadn't decided which one to abandon. The timing of her death made it impossible to know whether she would have chosen to leave David and the children to be with Jonathan, or whether she would have ended her relationship with Jonathan to focus entirely on her family. Jonathan Mitchell's grief over losing Maggie was complicated by his realization that he'd never actually known the complete woman he'd fallen in love with. During his relationship with Margaret, he'd often encouraged her to reconcile with her ex-husband for the sake of her children, not knowing that the ex-husband was actually her current husband and that the children she occasionally mentioned were living in her home every day. His letters to Margaret had been filled with plans for their future together, trips they would take and the life they would build once she was free from her obligations to her past. The discovery that these plans had been built on fundamental misunderstandings about her actual situation left him questioning his own judgment and his ability to truly know another person. The legal implications of Margaret's double life proved to be relatively minor, though there were some financial complications that David had to resolve. The apartment lease in Cincinnati had to be terminated and Margaret's belongings had to be removed, a process that felt like dismantling the life of a stranger rather than his wife. The bank account that Margaret had maintained under her maiden name had to be closed and the funds transferred to the estate, though the amount of money involved was relatively small. More significantly, David had to decide what to do with Margaret's artwork and her personal belongings from the apartment, items that represented 15 years of creative expression that their children had never known existed. The decision about Margaret's art became a family discussion that revealed how each member of the family was processing their mother's revelation. Emma wanted to keep the paintings and display them in their home, arguing that the artwork represented a part of their mother that deserved to be acknowledged and remembered. Michael was less interested in the art itself but wanted to keep his mother's guitars, instruments that none of them had known she could play. Sophie was fascinated by the photographs of her mother performing on stage, images that showed a confident, joyful woman who seemed very different from the careful, reserved mother she remembered. David ultimately decided to donate most of Margaret's artwork to the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, where Jonathan worked, creating a small memorial exhibition that would allow other people to appreciate the creative talents that Margaret had developed during her years as Maggie Collins. The exhibition, titled Hidden Lives: The Art of Margaret Collins, ran for 6 months and attracted attention from people throughout the Cincinnati arts community who had known and worked with Maggie over the years. For David and the children, attending the opening reception was both healing and heartbreaking, as they met people who had known their mother as an artist and saw how she'd been appreciated for talents they'd never known she possessed. The long-term impact of Margaret's revelations on her family's dynamics became apparent over the months following her death. David began attending grief counseling sessions that focused not just on losing his wife but on processing the realization that his marriage had been built on fundamental deception. The counselor helped him understand that Margaret's need for secrecy might have stemmed from her own internal conflicts about motherhood, marriage and personal identity rather than from a lack of love for him and their children. This understanding didn't eliminate his feelings of betrayal, but it helped him develop a more complex and compassionate view of his wife's choice. Emma's response to her mother's secret life evolved from initial anger and betrayal to a deeper appreciation for the pressures that women face in balancing personal fulfillment with family responsibility. She began researching the experiences of other women who had struggled with similar conflicts between individual identity and societal expectation, eventually writing her college application essay about the complexity of her mother's legacy and what it had taught her about the importance of authenticity in relationship. Emma's essay was accepted by several prestigious universities and she ultimately chose to study art therapy, combining her interest in creativity with her desire to help other people navigate complex emotional situations. Michael's processing of his mother's revelations took a different path, focusing more on questions about truth, honesty, and the nature of identity. He became interested in philosophy and psychology, spending hours reading about the ways that people construct and maintain different versions of themselves in different contexts. His research led him to a more nuanced understanding of his mother's situation, recognizing that her double life might have been a survival strategy rather than a deliberate attempt to deceive her family. This intellectual approach to his grief helped Michael maintain his emotional connection to his mother, while also acknowledging the complexity of her choices. Sophie's adjustment to her mother's revelations required different strategies, given her young age and limited understanding of the situation. David worked with child psychologists to help Sophie process the information in age-appropriate ways, focusing on maintaining her positive memories of her mother, while also helping her understand that adults sometimes make complicated decisions that children can't fully comprehend. Sophie's therapy sessions often involved art activities that allowed her to express her feelings about her mother through creative means, inadvertently connecting her with the artistic legacy that Margaret had hidden from her family for so many years. The neighborhood's reaction to Margaret's story continued to evolve long after the initial shock of the revelation. Some families became more suspicious and guarded, wondering what secrets their own neighbors might be hiding and questioning the authenticity of the relationships they'd developed with people in their community. Others became more understanding and compassionate, recognizing that everyone faces pressures and conflicts that might not be visible to outsiders. Martha Henderson, who had initially felt betrayed by Margaret's deception, eventually came to appreciate the enormous effort that Margaret had put into maintaining her family's stability while also pursuing her own need for creative expression. The broader questions raised by Margaret's story about the nature of identity, authenticity, and the pressures faced by women in traditional family roles sparked discussions throughout the Cleveland suburbs about the expectations placed on mothers and wives. Margaret's story was featured in several local publications and became the subject of online discussions about the sacrifices that women make for their families and the psychological costs of suppressing individual identity in service of family obligation. These conversations helped some families have more honest discussions about their own needs and expectations, potentially preventing other situations where someone might feel compelled to create an elaborate double life. Jonathan Mitchell's process of grieving Maggie while learning about Margaret created its own unique challenges. He attended the memorial exhibition of her artwork, but found it difficult to reconcile the woman he'd known with the mother and wife that her family described. Jonathan's friends encouraged him to be angry about Margaret's deception, but he found himself feeling more sad than betrayed, understanding that her situation had been impossible rather than merely dishonest. His relationship with Margaret had given him 7 years of happiness and love, experiences that remained meaningful even though they'd been built on incomplete information about her life. In the months following Margaret's death, Jonathan and David developed an unlikely friendship based on their shared love for the same woman and their mutual struggle to understand her complex motivation. Their conversations helped both men process their grief while also gaining a more complete picture of Margaret's personality and the internal conflicts she'd faced. Jonathan's insights into Margaret's artistic development and creative passions helped David understand aspects of his wife that he'd never seen, while David's stories about Margaret's dedication to their children and her skills as a mother gave Jonathan a fuller appreciation for the woman he'd loved. The resolution of Margaret's story, such as it was, came not through dramatic revelations or legal proceedings, but through the gradual acceptance by everyone who had loved her that people are more complicated than they appear, and that the pressure to fulfill societal expectations can lead to choices that seem inexplicable from the outside. Margaret's double life had been her attempt to reconcile irreconcilable demands on her identity, and while her methods had involved deception and emotional betrayal, her motivations had stemmed from very human needs for creativity, authentic connection, and personal fulfillment. David's final understanding of his wife came when he read her complete journals and realized that Margaret had never stopped loving him and their children, but she had also never been able to fully give up the person she'd been before marriage and motherhood transformed her life. Her Tuesday through Friday disappearances had been her way of maintaining contact with parts of herself that she felt unable to express within their family context, and her relationship with Jonathan had represented not just romantic love, but also the acceptance and appreciation of her artistic identity that she'd never felt from David. The tragic irony of Margaret's story was that David and the children might have been able to accept and support her artistic pursuits if she'd been honest about them from the beginning. But by the time her double life was established, the weight of her deception had made confession seem impossible, trapping her in a situation where she felt unable to be completely authentic with anyone. Her death had ended the immediate crisis of her unsustainable double life, but it had also prevented any possibility of reconciliation or honest resolution of the conflicts that had driven her to such elaborate deception. Today, more than 2 years after Margaret's death, the Sullivan family continues to process the implications of her secret life. David has begun dating again, but he approaches new relationships with a deeper awareness of the importance of encouraging partners to maintain their individual identities and interests. Emma is thriving in her art therapy program and has created several pieces that explore themes of identity and authenticity inspired by her mother's story. Michael has found peace with his mother's complexity and has developed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that serves him well in his relationships with friends and family. Sophie has grown into a confident 10-year-old who remembers her mother with love while also understanding that adults sometimes make choices that are difficult for children to understand. Margaret Sullivan's story serves as a cautionary tale about the costs of suppressing individual identity in service of family obligations, but it also illustrates the human capacity for creativity, love and resilience in the face of impossible circumstance. Her 15 years of living as two different people represented both an elaborate deception and a desperate attempt to honor different aspects of herself that seemed incompatible within the context of traditional family role. The pain that her revelation caused her family was real and lasting, but so was the love and dedication she had shown them throughout their lives together. The perfect mother's missing days were ultimately revealed to be not an abandonment of her family, but an attempt to preserve parts of herself that she felt unable to share with them. Margaret's tragedy was not that she was a bad mother or wife, but that she lived in a time and place where she felt unable to be a complete person within the context of her family relationship. Her secret apartment in Cincinnati and her identity as Maggie Collins represented not an escape from her real life, but an attempt to maintain access to aspects of herself that had been essential to her sense of identity and fulfillment. The investigation into Margaret's double life revealed that the woman her family and neighbors had known as the perfect mother was indeed perfect in her dedication to her family's well-being, but she was also human in her need for personal fulfillment and creative expression. Her story continues to resonate with people who struggle to balance family obligations with individual needs, serving as both a warning about the dangers of deception and a testament to the complexity of human identity and the universal need for authentic self-expression. The key led to a small vault at Fifth Third Bank in downtown Cleveland, a location that Margaret had apparently visited regularly during her Friday evening returns home. What the family found inside that safety deposit box would provide the most shocking revelation yet about the scope of Margaret's secret activities and the true extent of the life she'd been living away from Maple Ridge. Inside the vault were documents that revealed Margaret hadn't just been living a double life in Cincinnati, she'd been supporting an entirely different family. Birth certificates, adoption papers and financial records showed that Margaret had been the primary caregiver and financial support for 3 children in Cincinnati whose mother had died in a car accident. The children, Marcus, age 15, Olivia, 13 and little James, just 9 years old, had been living in a group home when Margaret first encountered them through her volunteer work at a local community center. The adoption papers, signed under her identity as Maggie Collins, revealed that Margaret had officially become the legal guardian of these 3 children in 2009. Just 3 years after she'd begun her double life in Cincinnati. For 12 years, while David and their biological children had assumed she was caring for her fictional sick mother in Toledo, Margaret had actually been mothering 3 additional children who had no idea that their beloved guardian Maggie had another family living 90 minutes away in Cleveland. Marcus Thompson, the eldest of Margaret's Cincinnati children, had been only 3 years old when his biological mother died in a head-on collision with a drunk driver. Olivia and James were even younger, barely 2 and just 6 months old respectively. The 3 siblings had been placed in foster care initially, but the system had struggled to find a permanent placement for all 3 children together. Margaret's involvement began as weekend volunteer work at the group home where they lived, reading stories and helping with homework. But according to the detailed journals she'd kept about her relationship with these children, Margaret had fallen in love with them almost immediately and had begun the complex legal process of becoming their guardian. The financial records in the safety deposit box revealed the true scope of Margaret's financial management and the sacrifices she'd made to support 7 children across 2 separate households. She'd been working part-time jobs in Cincinnati under her Maggie Collins identity, teaching art classes, playing guitar at local venues, and even working weekend shifts at a downtown coffee shop. Every dollar she'd earned had been carefully allocated between her 2 families, with detailed spreadsheets showing how she'd managed to provide for everyone while maintaining the appearance of financial stability in Cleveland. David's discovery of these records forced him to reevaluate every aspect of their marriage and family finances. Margaret's careful budgeting and occasional comments about needing to be more frugal suddenly made sense in the context of supporting 7 children instead of 3. Her insistence on shopping at discount stores, clipping coupons and maintaining strict household budgets hadn't been the habits of a naturally frugal person. They'd been the survival strategies of a woman supporting 2 complete families on a single modest income. The emotional impact of learning about Marcus, Olivia, and James was devastating for Emma, Michael and Sophie, who suddenly discovered they had 3 siblings they'd never known existed. The revelation that their mother had been caring for orphan children while telling them she was caring for her sick mother created a complex mixture of emotions: pride in their mother's compassion, confusion about her deception, and grief over the siblings they'd never had the chance to know. But the most shocking aspect of Margaret's guardian role was discovered when David and the children met Marcus, Olivia and James for the first time at a meeting arranged through the Cincinnati Department of Children's Services. The 3 Thompson children were devastated by the loss of the only mother figure they could remember, but they were also eager to share their memories of Maggie Collins with her biological family. What they revealed about Margaret's life in Cincinnati painted a picture of a woman who had been even more devoted and hands-on as a mother than she'd been in Cleveland. Marcus described how Maggie had attended every school event, helped with homework every evening, and had learned to cook all of their favorite meals. Olivia talked about the art projects they'd worked on together and the way Maggie had encouraged her interest in music by buying her a violin and arranging for lessons. 9-year-old James, who had no memories of his biological mother, considered Maggie to be his real mom and was confused about why she'd never mentioned having other children or living somewhere else. The children's descriptions of their daily routines with Margaret revealed the incredible logistics she'd managed for 12 years. She'd been attending parent-teacher conferences in Cincinnati on Wednesday evenings, helping with school projects and science fair presentations, driving children to soccer practices and piano lessons, and managing the complex schedule of 3 active children while simultaneously maintaining her responsibilities to her family in Cleveland. The organizational skills that David and their children had always admired now seemed almost superhuman in scope. Margaret's Cincinnati neighbors, when contacted by David, provided additional insights into the woman they'd known as Maggie Collins. They described her as an incredibly devoted single mother, who seemed to have unlimited energy for her children's activities and needs. Several mentioned that they'd always wondered how she managed financially since she only seemed to work part-time jobs, but they'd assumed she received some kind of support from the children's father or had inherited money from family. None of them had ever suspected that she was supporting another family in a different city. The legal complexities of Margaret's death became significantly more complicated with the discovery of her guardianship of the Thompson children. As Maggie Collins, she'd been their legal guardian and had made provisions in her will for their continued care. But as Margaret Sullivan, she'd also made provisions for her biological children and had left her estate to David. The 2 wills, created under her different identities, created competing claims that required months of legal mediation to resolve. David found himself in the unprecedented situation of suddenly becoming responsible for 3 additional children who were grieving the loss of their mother figure while also trying to understand their connection to the Sullivan family. The Thompson children had been temporarily placed back in foster care after Margaret's death, but the discovery of her biological family created new possibilities for permanent placement that no one had anticipated. The decision about what to do about Marcus, Olivia, and James became a family discussion that revealed the true character of each member of the Sullivan family. Emma immediately advocated for bringing her newly discovered siblings home to Cleveland, arguing that it was what their mother would have wanted and that the Thompson children had already lost too much in their young lives. Michael was more cautious, worried about the practical and emotional challenges of suddenly expanding their family, but he also felt a responsibility to honor their mother's commitment to these children. Sophie, now 10 years old, was excited about the possibility of having more siblings, but also worried about sharing her father's attention and whether there would be enough room for everyone in their house. David faced the most complex decision of his life: whether to take on responsibility for 3 children who were strangers to him but had been central to his wife's secret life for over a decade. The resolution came when David spent a weekend in Cincinnati with Marcus, Olivia, and James, staying in Margaret's apartment and seeing firsthand the life she'd built with them. He found photo albums documenting 12 years of birthdays, holidays, school events, and family vacations that Margaret had taken with the Thompson children. He saw school reports and art projects that Margaret had carefully preserved, exactly as she'd done for Emma, Michael, and Sophie. Most importantly, he saw how much the Thompson children loved and missed the woman they'd known as their mother. David's decision to formally adopt Marcus, Olivia, and James and bring them to Cleveland was influenced by his realization that caring for these children would allow him to honor the best aspects of Margaret's legacy, while also giving his biological children the chance to know the siblings their mother had loved and raised in secret. The practical challenges were enormous: finding a larger house, managing the emotional adjustment of 6 children dealing with grief and major life changes, and learning to parent 3 children who had known Margaret in ways that he never had. The integration of the 2 families was complicated and emotional, but it was also healing in unexpected ways. Marcus, Olivia, and James brought stories and memories of Margaret that helped Emma, Michael, and Sophie understand their mother more completely. They shared photos and videos of Margaret performing her music, teaching art classes, and simply being a mother in ways that were both familiar and completely new to her biological children. Emma found particular comfort in her relationship with 13-year-old Olivia, who shared her interest in art and had been Margaret's student for several years. The 2 girls spent hours looking through Margaret's artwork together, with Olivia explaining the techniques and inspirations behind pieces that Emma had never seen before. Michael bonded with Marcus over their shared experience of being the oldest children in their respective families and their mutual struggle to understand their complex feelings about Margaret's choices. Sophie and 9-year-old James became immediate best friends, with James helping Sophie process her grief through play and shared activity. James's uncomplicated love for the woman he'd known as Maggie helped Sophie remember the positive aspects of her mother without the confusion and anger that had sometimes clouded her memories since learning about Margaret's secret life. The expanded Sullivan family's first Christmas together was both joyful and heartbreaking, as they combined traditions from both households, while creating new ones that honored Margaret's memory. David found Margaret's guitar among her possessions in Cincinnati and asked Marcus to teach him the songs that Margaret used to play for the Thompson children. Emma organized art projects that incorporated techniques Margaret had taught Olivia and Jane. The holiday became a celebration not just of their family's expansion but of the complete woman Margaret had been, both the devoted mother they'd known and the creative, nurturing guardian who had raised 3 additional children with equal love and dedication. Today, 3 years after Margaret's death, and 2 years after the Sullivan family's expansion, David continues to discover new aspects of his wife's character through his relationships with Marcus, Olivia and Jane. The 6 children have adjusted to their new family structure with the resilience that Margaret had fostered in all of them, supporting each other through the ongoing process of grief and healing, while also building new relationships and shared experience. Margaret Sullivan's story ultimately revealed not just the complexity of human identity and the pressures of traditional family roles, but also the incredible capacity for love and sacrifice that had driven her to care for 7 children across 2 separate households for over a decade. Her deception had caused real pain and confusion, but it had also made possible the survival and thriving of 3 children who might otherwise have spent their childhoods in the foster care system. Her legacy lived on not just in the artwork she'd created and the music she'd performed, but in the 6 children who carried forward the values of compassion, creativity and dedication that she'd instilled in all of them, regardless of which identity she'd been using when she'd raised them.